Setting up your camera for a portrait picture is actually quite simple. You can do a couple things. One, your mode dial up here does have a scene mode for portrait. So just set your mode dial to the portrait scene. And what this does is it automates the camera. You can see that the ISO and white balance are both set to auto. And my drive mode is set to continuous. And this can be very helpful for portrait pictures. However, I can't turn my flash on, and I may not like using the auto white balance or the auto ISO because I may want to make sure that the ISO stays at 100, and I may want to set the white balance for tungsten if I'm located indoors. So instead of using this mode, what I prefer doing is turning your mode dial back to program. In the back you can see my ISO is currently set to 100. You can set yours depending on the amount of available light. Set the ISO by pressing the ISO button right here with your index finger, and using the down or up navigation buttons, set the appropriate ISO. I'm assuming we're outdoors and there's plenty of light, so I'm going to stick to 100. My white balance is currently set to daylight, and to change that, I'll press the WB button right here, and press the right or left button to move the indicating square. Now again, I'm assuming we're outdoors, so I'm going to stick to daylight. However, if you're in a shady area or if it's cloudy, then go with cloudy or shady in order to warm up the tones a little bit. If you're indoors, go ahead and use tungsten. It's the most common light used indoors. Or if it's fluorescent lighting, set your camera to fluorescent white balance. Press set to OK. And now we just want to change the drive mode from single to continuous shot. Go ahead and press the drive mode button here. It's the left navigation button. And move over to continuous shooting. Go ahead and press set. Now what that means is that when I press and hold the shutter button, the camera will continuously keep taking pictures until I release. Now because we're taking a portrait, and normally what I like doing with portraits is having a very shallow depth of field, we are using the program mode, so it will automatically choose the shutter speed and aperture for us. But what I can do is press my shutter button halfway to see what the settings are set to. And this is okay, but if I want this a little bit more shallow, what I can do is roll the dial before those figures go away. So I can choose F4 or F5 and then go back to my shutter button in order to keep those figures. As soon as these figures will disappear, once I've released the shutter button, I can press the shutter button again. It'll go back to the default, and then I can go back to the roll dial and choose again what I prefer. And go back to the shutter button, press it halfway again, and take my picture. Sometimes, especially when I'm outdoors and it's broad daylight, I like using the flash in order to eliminate some of the shadows on people's faces. So what you can do is press the flash button to pop the flash. By using the flash, there are a couple limitations that you should keep in mind. One is this built-in flash is really only good for about 15 feet. So if your subject is farther than that, you may as well not use the flash. The second thing is that because we're in the continuous shooting mode, by using the flash, we slow down the frame rate of the camera to about 1 picture every second, as opposed to 3.5 pictures per second. Lastly, by using the built-in flash, the camera will not be able to use a shutter speed faster than 1/200th of a second in order to synchronize with the flash. Which means if you're out in broad daylight, the camera is limited to 1/200th of a second. It'll have to use a smaller aperture size in order to compensate for the amount of light coming into the camera, and that's going to create a longer depth of field, which is not what you want for portrait photography. You want to keep that aperture smaller to get a shallower depth of field so that the person is in focus and the background is not. If you take a lot of portraits outdoors in the daylight, what I would highly recommend doing is investing in an external flash that will be able to first produce a lot more light and travel much farther than 15 feet. Second, it'll be able to sync much faster. And third, you won't have to worry about that 1 shot per second when using the continuous drive. The other thing that the flash will prevent you from doing is being able to use the roller dial to adjust the aperture. Without the flash, you can press the shutter button halfway, as I mentioned earlier, and then use the roller dial to move these values. But with the flash up, I'm rolling the dial, but the values are unchanged. And if you don't get a wide enough aperture in your situation, then you may need to go with the aperture value mode. Turning your mode dial to AV will allow you to set the aperture and then press the shutter button halfway, allowing the camera to set the shutter speed. Now again, with the AV mode, same limitations with the flash being up. The shutter speed will not be able to be more than 1/200th of a second, and if it's blinking 1/200, then you know the image will be too bright. But at least with the AV mode, unlike the program mode, you can set your aperture and use the flash. So remember, use either the program mode or the AV mode. Normally I use the program mode because I find the job it does is just fine for my situations. Set your ISO accordingly, set your white balance accordingly, and set the drive mode to continuous. Keep track of your aperture to make sure that your depth of field is shallow so that only the subject is in focus. Press the shutter button halfway, lock the center focusing point on your target. With the shutter button still pressed halfway, recompose the image, and then press the shutter button the rest of the way to take the picture. To find out much more about digital photography and your digital camera, go to lbguides.com.